Hey everybody, Jay Weidner here. We're at Reality Check. Thanks for watching. Got a really good show today. Please hit subscribe and share and everything. Before we go though, with my good guest, I want to show you guys something. I got this sent to me. I met this woman at the UFO conference and her name is Michelle, and she runs a company called Light the Light. And these are orgone generators. And they're just gorgeous. Look at that, she sent that for my garden. And that's why I'm all sunburned, because I've been working in my garden all week. Anyway, thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate it. And sent a bunch of them. Here's one other one. Look at that, beautiful. And this is the copper is where the orgone comes out. So that's how orgone, we're gonna do a whole show on orgone and plasma universe and all that. It's on future date, but things are pressing right now. And that's Light the Light, LITETHELIGHT.com, Michelle. And she will get you your orgone generators and make your house really happy and nice and help fight any viruses and all the other stuff. So anyway, my guest today is a return guest, Jonny Enoch. Hey, Jonny, how are you?
I'm good, Jay. The immune in me recognizes the immune in you. No mistake.
Oh, that's funny. That's really funny. Good, because we're going to need some levity because we're going to have some serious discussions today on the show. So basically, everybody wonders what's going on. And the numbers are coming in on the virus, and they're way lower than they told us they would be. But there's still something going on. A virus is still going around, but it's just a lower end virus that strikes people who have already had something or aging problems or things like that. So I'm not diminishing the virus at all when I say that. I'm just saying that, you know, there was a lot of things that we did, and maybe they helped bring those numbers down. We'll never know. We really will never know. But things are about to get back to normal for a little while, and people are wondering what's going on. And Jonny and I both have different resources and sources, and we've been getting the word. And so then we're talking, and we realize that we're both on the same page pretty much about what is happening. And so we wanted to tell you and share it with you because you guys deserve to know. And remember, just because there is a reality that we're describing, that does not mean it will be the reality. We all know that things can shift on a dime, and that when you have the knowledge about what is going on, you now have the knowledge to do something about it. And that's why you need to have the knowledge as fast as possible, so that we can, if possible, change what's about to happen. I'm not sure it's possible because people in charge are so steadfast on it. And I know that the technocracy is growing day by day, and the technocrats are ruling this world, and they're going to continue to rule this world. So with that said, I'd just like to say that the coronavirus may or may not be man-made. We don't know that yet. All we know is that it has changed the world, and there's no doubt about that. So Jonny, where do you want to take it?
Well, I think that that's a great statement and a great place to start. You know, what is this virus? Where does it come from? And could it be man-made? I tend to think it is, because we get a lot of clues when we look at what the earlier researchers were saying about it. You know, when we look at the outside of this thing, we know it's composed of these things. When we see glycoproteins, or we see what bacteriophages are. And what bacteriophages are is, if you go look in a drop of, let's say, ocean water, there's literally millions of these things, and they're the antithesis to life. Their whole job is to kill microbacteria out there, and they're evolving, over periods of millions of years. They're like these super machines. So when you see this thing, the outside of it, when you look at it, is that it's got this shell on the outside that is a SARS-2 outer shell, and it's perfectly intact. It hasn't mutated. If this thing was from nature, if it was a mutation, the earlier researchers said, it would have been different, but it's not. We know what we've also seen, what they've said is that it had the retrovirus that had like an HIV spliced insertion on the middle of it. And by doing that, it's very clever what it can do. So for one, we know that it acts differently for everybody. It can attack their T cells, cause this problem in the body called a cytokine storm. It goes into when we look at the hemoglobins with the red blood cells, again, there's that blood clotting cardiovascular issue with it. At the same time, it does something very clever, is that it also rewrites itself into your RNA. And we'll come back to that, why that's important. The ribonucleic acid, that it's now in the human genome. It's like an operating system that's with us, which is really interesting. It's a fascinating part about this. But on the end of this thing, it's got spliced onto the very end of it a fungus which operates like tuberculosis. And the reason you want to do that is that so when it's airborne, that it can move quicker. Now, what's fascinating about that is that you could kind of say that this is why there's so much going under the hood, why it's so heavy. It's 90 to 100 nanometers thick. We know some very interesting things about it, that, of course, it's been confirmed now that you can kill it in ultraviolet light or the sun or under certain heat conditions. But you might say that these sort of weaponized pathogens have been very carefully released at certain points on our planet. Over the years, we've heard of stuff like, avian flu and swine flu and stuff like that. But when we go back and look at the earlier models of this, most certainly you could say that stuff like Ebola, it was killing too quickly. It was hemorrhaging the brain. So that's not going to work. When they went over to SARS, SARS didn't move fast enough. It didn't have that speed. So this is sort of that perfected model. And again, it's very particular and it's very mutagenetic. So in the future, it can be mutated into all sorts of different ways, which is rather fascinating. So that brings it back, Jay, into us asking, if we know it exists, we know that, like you said, there seems to be a faster recovery time than what we're being told in the media. There's a lot of things that are being jazzed up for us. There's definitely an agenda of sorts that we see that's going on that is there to match what they call the simulation. Yeah. Where did that come from, and why is it so important that that narrative is maintained? We got to ask ourselves, who would be capable of putting this together and planning it? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that that there's no doubt that there's a certain former CEO of a famous software company who's involved in this and has been and did tests and dry runs and warned us at various conferences that this was coming. And you have to wonder why a guy interested in technology is interested in medicine. It's kind of strange bedfellows, I think. So I think, I don't know, I think that there's no doubt that what you're saying about it, probably it is man-made. I know Cliff High insists it is, and he has pretty good reasons for it. But I think it doesn't really matter, because it's how they react to it. And that's what we have to have the ball watch, because that tells us everything. And the reaction has been huge. And we know Sweden didn't react at all, and they're fine. But we don't know what they've got planned for us further. I would say that this is a dry run to see how it happens, and then they're going to probably be other weaponized things that come out, and they're kind of warning us that anyway. And so I think that this is part of a larger plan to achieve a goal, right? Now, I'll just going to say this at the start so that people understand. I was once gifted by going to a very wealthy man's library. And I've told the story before. I could read anything in his house, but I couldn't take anything out. So I would just go there all day, because I'd sold a couple screenplays. I had money. And so I'd just go and I'd read all day long. It was in Seattle. And one of the books he had was I can't, I was paraphrasing here, the real reason for Freemasonry. And it was about a 100-year-old book. And I read it, and it said that the whole point of Freemasonry, the guilds and all of these things, is to transform the human race. And I didn't know what that meant. I thought it was some kind of spiritual thing. Wasn't sure at the time. I was like 25 years ago. And so I thought, I wonder what that means. And so I've always kind of been watching. And I think what you're about to hear is the mechanism for the transformation of the human race. And I'm not sure that the transformation of the human race is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying that that's what they're doing. And that's their motivation. So let's get into it. So no doubt what's going to happen here is that they're going to create a vaccine for this thing, right? And then they're going to make it mandatory.
There's so many different layers to where it comes from, why it was created, and how it's being used. The old idea is that don't let a good crisis go to waste, right? So this current biological emergency that we face has many different levels. And before we go any further, I do want to speak with the caveat that I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a microbiologist or a doctor. So we're just researchers. Yep. And I, just like yourself, I get briefings from certain folks in knowledgeable places, as well as I do utilize remote viewers, which I want to share some of what they talked about today. And also the esoteric factor of where this fits in, because as you mentioned, secret societies have played a very important role in our planet for a very long time. We go back into the Pythagoreans, with Pythagoras of Samos from his little school that was burned to the ground, or Jacques de Molay from the Knights Templars, or the Knights of Malta. They've all held on to this knowledge that was kept from the profane, with this idea of preserving ideas. And so, as we both know, and I know you're very familiar with this, is that these orders in the world, and there's many of them that are invisible behind the scenes, they all have particular ideas and philosophies and ways of transforming consciousness in the world. And we're being influenced by so many of these groups. But what I've also been told is that much of what gets passed down into our world comes from about 3,000 light years away from here. And there are certain groups on our planet that are at that table that are having those conversations. So most of those guys that you see on the front stage, men and women that you see on the front stage, or even these wealthy families that we all like to point fingers at from time to time, that we ask questions and we look at them and say, well, who's really pulling the strings? They might sit across from the table, across from the table, across from the table from the people doing it, but it's like it says in the Tao Te Ching. It says the name that can be named is not the nameless name or the ineffable name. So if you see someone on the front stage, that's sort of just a manager or someone that stepped up to the position and volunteered. But they're not the ones, pulling the strings, which for the most part, we could say perhaps is non-human intelligence. But when we look over at this, let's just break it down on the first layer, that a lot of these guys in these particular areas, they have a belief in eugenics. They have a belief in looking at the world as they have a superior knowledge and intellect and ideas that come about that. And what I mean is that there's something we could say is called the 322 philosophy. And you and I have discussed this, and this is something you've written about extensively, Jay. And so when we look over at the 322 philosophy, many of you might be familiar with a club. And I'm just looking over here in my paperwork, a club that is available over at Yale that is called the Skull and Bones. And on their door, I had a picture of it here, but it seems to have slipped away from me. On their door, it says 322 under it. Now, I'm not saying that they are the only ones that have this philosophy, so I'm not singling them out by any means. But if you look at where the 322 comes from, it actually is from Genesis 3:22 in the Bible. And Genesis 3:22 in the Bible, I'll just read the passageway out for all of you guys so you can hear what it says. It says, "Look, the human beings have become like us, knowing both good and evil. What if they reach out, take the fruit from the tree of life and eat it? Then they will live forever." So essentially, it's saying they become like the gods, or the Elohim, those non-human intelligences which came to the earth and helped us along a very long time ago. So these folks are like the gardeners of humanity. So going further, we get some more clues about the 322 philosophy. Many of you out there might be familiar with something that's known as the Georgia Guidestones, which I know you're familiar with, right, Jay?
Oh yeah, I've visited them many times.
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely incredible, made of granite towering over us. What is it, 14 feet tall or something on those lines? And on the side, you know, we find all kinds of interesting inscriptions and markings. First of all, we know that it acts as a clock. It acts as a calendar. But also, it has 8 different languages on there, including Egyptian as one of them. Perhaps one of the most curious things that we find on the side of the Georgia Guidestones is it says to maintain humanity, the population, under 500 million in a perpetual balance with nature.
Yep.
So that's very curious. A lot of people all over the world have scratched their heads and they've said, who made these great monuments? Who made this strange edifice? But we get clues perhaps when we see the date that it was raised. It was raised on March 22nd, 322, 1980.
Yep,
So 1980, 40 years ago, right?
Yep.
40 is a quad. Quad equals quarantine. Now, when you're doing ritual, when you're looking at these things, dates are very important. And so when you see that, what do we see that happened recently with this quarantine? Well, out of London, in the major banking city, I should know, I left one day earlier than the 22nd. I just left out of London a day prior to that. London, the major banking city, and all across Europe, they had a giant shutdown on 3/22, 2020, 2/2. So that's when things started to roll out. Yep. And we get a lot of other interesting connections to this 3/22, which is really interesting, that has this philosophy that comes with it. You know, as we look further, we start to see a connection to other themes. Many of you out there may have heard that there is a certain ancient Canaanite being, a being that's an ancient Canaanite demon, so to speak, that's found at sort of the head of some of these folks as their ancient religion that they are part of. That's right, Moloch.
Moloch.
Right, so Bohemian Grove, right?
Yep.
There's a certain island that allegedly had people flying there, very important people flying there for sex tourism with a very controversial. Yeah, there you go. On the island, there was a little temple there that may have had a Moloch on top of it.
Yep.
Now, what I find very curious is that last year, there was a Moloch put out in front of the Roman Colosseum.
Yep.
And when he was put out there, he had these chains attached to him. Now, what is, Jay, maybe you can enlighten the folks, what is Moloch known as?
Well, he's an owl, and that means that he's the animal that works at night in the darkness while we're sleeping. And there's an old, in the intelligence community, they have a thing. They have the roosters and the owls. And the roosters are the intelligence agents that know everything and are trying to tell the world about what's really going on. And the owls are the intelligence agents that want to keep everybody asleep. And there's a war, supposedly, between the roosters and the owls. And so also, I just wanted to comment on the guy who supposedly financed the building of the Georgia Guidestones was a guy, we don't know his real name, but his pseudonym was R.C. Christian, implying once again one of these Masonic links like Rosicrucian Christian, right? And the
Christian of the Rosy Cross
is all about that, right? And so that's an allusion to it. Although I do believe that Ted Turner had something to do with the Georgia Guidestones, and he's very concerned with depopulation of the earth. That's one of his top goals.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of our academics and intellectuals most certainly say that quite often. They say that the world is overpopulated. Now, the idea, if that is true or not, it might just be, you know, within those particular views. We know that actually there's places like Africa that have a lot of resources and land where agriculture could be expanded, and there's enough areas there with resources to feed the entire world. So, you know, these ideas could be greatly, you know, debated in many areas. But before we leave the topic of Moloch, what's interesting about Moloch, Moloch is also known as the bringer of plagues. So You see, if you look closely, this is in front of the Roman Colosseum, that there's chains that are attached to Moloch. The chains were removed when you go outside of 322, 2020. And of course, the Pope was coming out there for a sacred ceremony to go to the ancient Canaanite demon bringer of plagues. And he was finally released off his chains and removed into the world by the 29th. And this is something you can look up on the web. It's there. I just think it's very interesting, the symbolic significance. And I'm not saying that everybody in the world is, a part of these sorts of ideas and ancient religions and whatnot, but there is something to that. Now, before we leave that, it's very interesting because you and I both know a lot of remote viewers, a lot of people that do this sort of work. And I've worked with various remote viewers, and they don't like to be called psychics because they see what they do as more serious. They've done training over at the Monroe Institute. They find bodies for the police. One of those people I worked with was Patricia Mona. And she has letters from law enforcement agencies when she drives around and literally finds bodies for these people. So she was telling me some interesting things that I've shared with you also that correlated with other psychics. I asked her to remote view the virus for me. And she said that she saw it coming into this world, or that it was dedicated or perfected in 2017. Whatever they were working on was dedicated or perfected. But what the remote viewers were telling me is they saw it being dedicated at the time of the eclipse. So there's an esoteric symbolic connection to that, the eclipse in 2017 at the end of August. Now, they said that it was brought forth on some kind of altar. There was a dedication that they felt like almost not only a feeling that there was a presence of evil coming into the world, but the people that were responsible for this, the particular groups that had these views, had felt that there was going to be a cleansing of sorts that was to come along with this. Like there was some ancient sort of fulfillment of whatever that they were doing. Now, when I mentioned this to you, that this data had come in, you told me something interesting about when that ritual would have to begin and end.
Yeah, the ritual began. I heard that the ritual began on the eclipse in 2017 in August, and that it's going to be 6 years and 9-month ritual, and that it will come to an end when the full eclipse again crosses the United States again in April of 2024. 2024 is going to shape up to be a really interesting year. There's so many planetary alignments. All the planets are going to be all the way over on one side of the sun. And we're going to, every night, you're going to go out throughout 2024 and you're going to see a conjunction after conjunction of planets. Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Venus, they're all on one side. And at the same time that we're having the eclipse. So it's a total eclipse. It's another total eclipse, the second one. And that's how long this ritual that they're doing is going on. And I suspect that everything will be changed. I'm going to guess that the whole world will be completely changed by the end of 2024, ramping up to what they have ready to go by 2030, when their little experiment is going to end. But this is the first part, the first 7-year or so part, and they're using the eclipse as their ritual guideline. And yeah, I guess taking the chains off of Moloch means that he's unleashed.
That's exactly
together. Obamacare was passed on 3/22 universal time. It's just a number of different rituals. There's 22 spaces in the tree of life. It's just these guys are playing these big games, and what they're doing, just so everybody knows, it's not so much that they're occultists as they communicate using occult language. so that they know when they use the 322, everybody who knows what 322 means understands what they've just been told. The same time when they use the number 33, which they use all the time in songs and advertising and all this, that's a sign that you're dealing with another Freemasonic front organization, and they want anyone who knows how to read the language to understand it. And so that's another way that you can pick up knowledge, is knowing their symbols and how they use them. And 322 is a huge one, gigantic.
Absolutely.
So,
There's
is
so
unleashed on the world. And now, what's the next thing that's going to happen, do you think?
Well, before we go down this rabbit hole, looking at this idea of what the different reasons for this coming out are, and we haven't seen the end of it, as you and I are going to discuss. As I've been told in my briefings, I've been told by very knowledgeable folks that virus politics are with us for the decade, and it's going to start to get very, very interesting as we go down this timeline, and we will discuss. But when we talk about the idea that the instructions for this are coming from non-human intelligence, and when I say that these folks are looking at Moloch, maybe Moloch is the personification of their ideas. Maybe they are getting some sort of multi-dimensional intelligence in the multiverse that is, giving them information. Most certainly we know that these folks that are involved in these sort of predilections or have these sort of proclivities, that they have these philosophies and viewpoints, and there's a type of occult pageantry that also goes on at some of these levels to keep these folks involved and keep them in their positions. And then there are different levels and structures to this, which is very fascinating. But if we go back to the Bible, which is very interesting, because we can actually go back to any of our ancient religions or histories, there's a very interesting story that starts to come out that's very similar. And I know you're well versed in this. So if we go back to the stories in Genesis, which we know is based on the Sumerian and Enuma-Elish, it comes from the 4th and 6th centuries BCE. There's events in there that are hundreds and thousands of years apart. Yep. We have this story, as you know, that talks about the Elohim, who are this plurality of beings. They come to earth and they say, let us make man or Ish in our image. It doesn't say that they're creating the earth from scratch. In fact, a lot of Christians, incorrectly believe this because there was a mistranslation of a word there, where they think it means that the earth was created from void and without form. That word there from the Hebrew is tohu vavohu, which actually translates to waste and destruction. And it says it's being recreated. They were re-terraforming the earth. And we were essentially this genetic experiment, it says, that's coming out of this particular area that could live over 950 years. And through that, we were given certain instructions that the other groups that we were created from, because it doesn't say they created us from scratch. It said, let us take man, or this primitive, maybe an ape or a chimpanzee or a primitive hominid, and it said, let's make him in our image. Let's give him an upgrade. But we were told there are certain people that we weren't supposed to be crossing and mix matching with our certain genetics, and we were given very specific instructions. Long story short, we know things got out of hand. Down the road, there was all kinds of chromosome mix matching. We even have another story at one point, all kinds of extraterrestrial stories in the Bible, not only of the story of Ezekiel, that he encounters a UFO with thousands of little blinking eyes on it with these shining cylinders that were awesome that land, and he goes and takes a ride up in there in the commander chair in the throne. But we get a story in the book of Enoch about these watchers that come to Earth. And we get this idea that there was instructions that these ETs that were on a reconnaissance mission, they were told not to, mix and match when they came to Earth, but they thought that the women on Earth looked really good and they wanted to have sex with them. So it said in Watchers 6, 7, and 8 that they laid with the daughters of man and they had an offspring with them. But there was a chromosome mix matching, and they produced these kind of freakazoids and giants and everything else. So what does it say? It said they started to create these floods on Earth and cataclysmic destructions. And later on, we see the ideas of plagues. And it says that these things were sort of a means to take down the population. So what if these gardeners of humanity are still watching us as a zoological experiment? But because of things like what we see out there, like in Star Trek, called the Prime Directive, where they can't get involved in our day-to-day stuff, they can't make the decisions for us, they need the power structures from the people on Earth. So as it's been explained to me, and I know you've been told similar things, that how it works is that a lot of us have this idea that there is this one group out there that is a bunch of old men sitting behind a desk, and they're all gathered around, and they control everything. They're all pushing and pulling the strings. A lot of people have this image, or they'll think, hey, those must be all those powerful families in the world. They're all working together to control us. Well, from what I've been told, even those families don't necessarily agree with each other. They don't all have the same philosophies and views. These groups do not all have the same agenda. But what happens is that a lot of the old power structures on our planet do get together at least once a year. And there are conversations about these sort of mandates and agendas. And the best way I could explain this is it's almost like, let's say if you've ever worked at a company and you've been a manager there at that company, you go get a quote from different contractors and you say to the contractors, who's got the best way of doing this? Who wants to put their horse in the race? Who wants to kind of put this in? Nobody gets involved with each other's horse, but everyone kind of stands back and they watch whose horse is going to win the race, sort of thing. And it's sort of like watching a football game. Some might have a view that's very eschatological, end of the world. Others might want to speed us up. Others might want to slow us down and pull us back a few notches. So you could say that there's a certain blueprint for our future that has to take place, that it's been passed down to us, that it's kind of like, well, this is what needs to be done, guys. You guys need to speed up and get on with it. Now, however way, do you want to do it the painful way? Do you want to do it the fast way? But this is the planet you guys are currently on. And these guys, they know their days are numbered in the future too, these power structures, because eventually we're going to outgrow them. But they kind of want to just feed the monster to be the last ones eaten. So let's look at what the agenda might be really quickly and break it down. First of all, we know there is a eugenics agenda. That agenda, in looking at population, again, you and I are not endorsing this. We're not out there saying, hey, we want that. We're just saying that that's what it is and what these monuments say and what's been there. Okay, so we have that as one agenda. The second agenda is, I've been aware for a few years that this is something that's gone around in the banking world, that's been told to me by people that are privy to knowledge in the banking world. This has been around for over 30 years, that there was supposed to be 3 economic crashes. Now, the first crash was to be in 2008, which we know happened. It got the system out. We know that it created a recession. The second crash, I was told, and I've told you about this, Jay. The second crash that I was told about was going to be for 2020. And that crash in 2020 was going to make the Great Depression look like a Tea Party. So as it already is, it's in the works. So as it was explained to me, is that how this works is that how the economics really works. And I'm not an economist, so it had to be explained to me. But how it works is that this is more based on, rather than flattening the curve, when countries open their doors, it's more based on trade deficits. So this is a part of a particular agenda to roll out a new technocratic idea, but at the same time, where it comes in as far as trade deficits go. I want to come back to that a little bit, because when we talk about trade deficits, we also have to get into the idea of where they're going with this, of creating a new currency. There's an idea of moving into a new system that's going to be a digital currency, which we will explore and talk about in just a moment. But the third crash I was told about, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this if you've been told similar. The third crash was going to be a smaller crash. It will be a few years later from now, but it's going to be much smaller, and it will just be to balance things out. And I was told that's the last ever crash that we're going to see. And now I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
No, I heard that the next crash is 2024. So I think that's what's going to be. And then there's like, we're involved in like the takeoff. That started in 2017, and it's like a huge, C-130 taking off, and it's lumbering and it's clumsy and everything, and it's not going to be easy. And then we're going to hit What I've been told is that there's going to be, over that time period between now and 2024, a release of the technologies, the disclosure technologies, the free energy, all sorts of advanced genetic technologies, and probably zero-G craft that we can fly around with. And you can sort of feel like they're getting us ready for it with all this UFO talk from the Pentagon and everything. So I've been told that over the next 4 years is going to be disclosure amidst chaos. That's how it was described to me.
It's interesting you should say that. I was told that part of this economic reset that we're going to go through, that is part of the transformation, is that it's also been in preparation for replacing the fossil fuel-based economy, so that there are groups that have been dependent on that. And you see that being affected right now with Saudi. But in that particular area, when we talk about what's happening in this economic reset, we have to go back to 74, 75 to get an idea of what happened with charge cards. Charge cards, when they were rolled out, they were first rolled out in Australia. Now, the reason for that is that Australia was a small and dependable economy. And when it was first rolled out, many people have heard Ike talk about a conspiracy on the internet where he said there was a certain secret society that they all had charge cards and they were charging as much as they wanted. What I was told, it didn't have so much to do with the secret society, but rather these were the business men at the time, that they just had these charge cards, and what they would do is they would buy a boat or a house with no limit on it, and it was all a write-off to them. So this was to them a wonderful thing. They were testing it out, and so that was where they first rolled these things out, was in Australia. Well, the same was true with Bitcoin. Bitcoin, if you look at the history of it, which is very strange, of course, as you know, there's an intelligence factor of who really developed the blockchain currencies and why it was developed, which now you're going to find that blockchain is going to be phased out more and more, and it's going to be regulated because it was being tested for these years. It was first rolled out in Australia, and then it was rolled out for the rest of the world, and we saw various trends on it. And, as I tell people, everybody has that one cryptocurrency guy that's absolutely nuts that calls you in the afternoon and he goes, dude, why aren't you just putting all this money into Bitcoin and Litecoin? And the next morning you wake up and all the money is gone, so they pushed it and pulled it from every area.
And too.
Yeah, I got stuck in that one a couple times. I bought some up because somebody told me to. Then it's doing really well. The next day you log in, it's worth nothing. Yes. So that was all part of a great test, I was told. And so just like the EU, now that you see that Brexit's allowed to go through and what's been happening, the EU is also a test project.
Right.
And so there's been a very interesting test, but most certainly the whole purpose of blockchain being this untraceable peer-to-peer sort of ability to replace cash. This is the idea, to have that rolled out as that next level, to eliminate cash. And you're starting to see that now with people saying you can't spend cash because it has viruses on it. I don't know how it is over where you are in Colorado, but over here, everywhere you go, people won't accept your cash.
That's right. All credit cards now. Everything's changed. And all through the state. We were just in a bigger city the other day, and nobody would take the cash. So it's already starting.
Yeah, so that is part of it. So the next layer is that people say, well, where does China fit into this? And I know, Jay, how much you love China, and you're always talking about them on your show.
Everyone knows I really don't like the Chinese government, for sure.
So the interesting thing, as it was explained to me, when I've had my sit-downs and briefings about this, is that the first thing I was told is, do you think China's a country? And of course I said, well, yeah, you see Xi up there and everything. And they said to me, no, China is not a country. Anybody in the world of intelligence and world leadership, they understand how China works. China is very complex. Canada's been around over 150 years. They call themselves a country. The U.S. since 1776, England since 1066. China is a civilization. They've been around for over 6,000 years, running concurrently since the time of the Egyptians. And so they're a very complex structure. Moreover, we know they have these 5 provinces, and you might say, just maybe, let's speak hypothetically here, of course, that perhaps one of the greatest magic tricks that we've ever seen is to believe that China and Taiwan are these great enemies. But what if the same families that are running the show are actually living in the Taiwanese mountains? And wouldn't it be an interesting magic trick that in the near future, that if China were to go in there and envelop Taiwan, and everyone thought this was this terrible invasion when actually it was all part of the same show the whole time. So these groups, they come to the table. And this is just an example. There are two types of people that look at world affairs. And there's some very intelligent people that you can sit down at a dinner table with, and they'll be talking about the news and what they saw. You can look at the circus going on over here that has all these different political figures and representatives that are out here. And there's people that are going to debate what this politician said to this politician. And then when there's another type of person, and I'm putting the reality check viewers in this category, Jay, that are looking at the layers of the onion, that they understand that you have Pinocchio over here and you have Geppetto up here. So within this particular area, there are all these various interests that are going on that have their horse in the race that we talked about, that all have their own theme, their own ideologies, their own way of doing things. So these different groups in the background are meeting, and some of them are working in unison together on certain ideas. So then let's talk about the next factor to this. There obviously is a factor of what is the purpose for this thing? Does it have an overall theme? Is it going to go away so easily? From what I've been told, why it's spreading so quickly and why there's a 98% recovery rate and the whole dialogue that we're being given is that, yes, most people are supposed to get it. They're supposed to get it. It will pass around from everyone. And if you don't get it that way, you are going to get it through they would love to see you get it through an immunization program where that's going to be RNA based. Currently, we know in some of the tests that they're doing for this particular thing is what they're doing is they're taking the genes from off of, when you look at the proteins or you look at the little spikes on the outside of this thing, they're trying to take the genes from that and they're crossing it with, the common cold or a virus, and that's a mild version of it, and they're giving it to people in test studies in the UK, and they're hoping to have that available by the fall.
Why do they want everyone to get it?
Well, that's the thing. This is a part of a greater program, and a lot of people don't want to hear this, but a lot of people want to believe that there's going to be one person or the other that's going to be the absolute savior and that's going to absolutely stop everything from happening. And I want to say that all of these folks that are coming to the table, whatever version of it, there's some versions better than others. Let's put it that way. From when I'm talking about political movements and stuff, the idea is that they all, in a sense, though, they know that there's a certain plan that has to roll out, and there's a certain theme. And we'll get to that about, it's all about control. It's about structure. And there is a certain genetic factor that wants to go in there. But the idea right now is that you're going to see these things called immune passports. And these immune passports are just getting talked about now, but this is part of the idea. They've come together with ideas of using a digital version of tracking this through something called the transdermal tattoo that people would have to take. And this transdermal tattoo, as you've heard all about it, and other means of tracking this, is just the beginning of where people would be, monitored based on how many immunizations they've had. This will actually dictate the idea of whether you can go into the grocery store eventually and buy milk. If this transdermal tattoo would be given to newborn babies. It'd be replaceable every 6 months to a year. And there's guys out there, by the way, that have this technology like Microsoft, who you've seen that has patents at the moment. The interesting thing about the patent that was filed, as you probably saw, that was published on the 26th of March. Did you see the patent number?
No. What was it?
The patent number, you can look this up. I mean, this stuff is biblical looking. I got to say that it's just humorous. The patent number is 060606 for the actual U.S. patent number for the technology that's there. And this is not just made up conjectures. This is stuff you can look up. So it's very interesting of where that goes. But I was told, Jay, is that what the overall purpose for this is, you may find and I just want to say, speaking hypothetically here, I'm not making any claims, you might find that in the near future that people that have been survivors of the old CV, and I know a lot of people out there want to say that the CV is just made up. They want to say that it's, an augmented reality. They want to say that it's no worse than the common cold. I'm telling you that for some people, it is a nasty thing, within 5 days. But for almost everyone, even people who have O blood types or AB plus blood types with the right antigens, that get over it very quickly, it lingers. I've talked to people that had it with mild to no symptoms. Even they got weird stuff like liver damage, a flushed face, weird dermatological features. They said it definitely for weeks and months they could feel that there was something not quite right. It is much different than anything you've encountered.
And it's been around for a little bit longer than they're telling us, because people here began getting ill in November with sustained illness that would not go away, respiratory. So I think it was here a little earlier than they think. And I do believe that even I may have caught it, and others. And so I think it's more pervasive. That's where I'm going with this.
Absolutely. So the one thing with it that's rather fascinating is that we know it's changing us because it's in our human genome. It's like software. So one of the things that you might find in the coming weeks or months that people will talk about is sterility and infertility in men. Pay very close attention that why people will say that it affects men differently in certain hormonal levels. Pay very close attention to that. There's a reason for that. So in order to understand what's going on here and why an immunity passport would be so important, why an immunity passport? Why would you want to have changes happening genetically over a period of time? And again, before we go any further, again, I'm just presenting this as a researcher. People out there, when they hear stuff like that, they'll point fingers and go, this guy is a transhumanist. He's trying to push this stuff. I'm just presenting, what it appears to be.
That's the facts, ma'am. So I just want to repeat what you're saying here, just so that nobody loses us. It's going to become required because of the CV, the virus, that, and we're going to call it that from now on so we can stay away from the AI. YT has this AI that watches for stuff.
Yes.
So we'll just call it CV. So anyway, everyone's going to have CV because it's all pervasive. We know that. And some may not even get symptoms, but they still have it. And that's the whole point. And that will then necessitate getting these patches so that we are immune to the virus, right?
Right. So these immunizations are also going to become a lot more user-friendly. You're going to find that there's going to be nasal sprays, passages. It's not all going to be just poked with a needle. It's going to become a lot more user-friendly, a lot more progressive. And I suspect that after the initial testing and
vaccines?
Yes. That stage, those stages that we go through, this is going to be a lot more progressive looking. It's going to be endorsed. It's going to be mandated in some cases. It's going to become more and more after the initial rollout. The initial rollout we know will be, there'll be some kinds of testing, maybe even antibody testing, biometric scanners and, thermal scanners and all that sort of stuff. And then this will become more of a thing saying, if you want society to go back to normal, you better get on board with this. But essentially what we got to look at, first of all, if any of you out there are familiar with what's known as CRISPR or CRISPR-9. So we know we can do
in our last interview.
Right. We know we can do gene editing, right? So that's essentially what this appears to be. The CV appears to be synthetic biology. So with synthetic biology, we know we can manipulate certain bacteria. We can add a sugar carrier and model it out. That appears to be what it is. So we get a very good clue of this when we look at our DNA. Our DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. We know it has 64 codons. We know it communicates this intelligent information and back and forth with something known as RNA. RNA is known as ribonucleic acid. We break it down into your cellular structure. Now, why is this interesting? Because your RNA has these 4 parts to it. They're called nitrogenous bases. We call them adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. And these 4 bases, you could say that you can program these, when we look at your RNA, like binary code, 1001. So we can reprogram it and we can restructure things. Now, why would we want to do that? So if we think about, what does an advanced extraterrestrial civilization look like? Like, you take the Greys, for example, and I know you've heard all about the Greys for years and years, Jay. The different types, whether you're talking to people, some say that there's these Zeta Reticuli Greys, taller Greys. Some say that they're artificial intelligent biological life forms. But anybody who's ever talked about the Greys of coming back from abductions and stuff, and I've worked with people doing clinical hypnotherapy regressions on abductees. They say that they had all kinds of reproductive experiments done on them. They said that the Greys had telepathically told them that they cannot reproduce, and their society is all done through genetic engineering, through families coming together and seeing a doctor. So if you sterilize everybody to that point, which it appears that's what would potentially be the outcome here, is that in the future, what you would do is that if you want to have a family, you would go with your partner over to a geneticist or a doctor, and disease would be edited out. You'd pick the eye color, the hair color of wherever you're going.
Designer babies.
Exactly, designer babies. But why would you want to keep this going for a decade? Why would a decade be important? Well, remember, going back into the Genesis story, and going back into these older versions of this narrative, is that it was saying that, okay, even go back into what we know in our anthropology and our primitive hominids. We have Neanderthals. We had Homo erectus. We had Denisovan up in Siberia. I mean, all these hunter-gatherer sort of primate genes of aggression and whatnot. Our scientists, and this is even from Science Daily, they talk about something called the warrior gene, monoamine oxidase A, and they talk about this enzyme breakdown on how we've identified certain warrior-like populations and people that have these sort of genetic traits. So perhaps you could say you could take the particular areas that you want to have this genomic area that you want to either take this recessive quality, you want to disable that, or you want to turn it off. You could have a genetic experiment to hybridize the human race over a 10-year period. This is very fascinating because before the show started, you and I were talking about Dean Koontz and what he wrote in Eyes of Darkness back in 1981. He was talking about the Wuhan 400 virus, and you mentioned a famous psychic who also mentioned this in her book, right?
Right, Sylvia Brown. So they're probably hooked into the whole thing, I'm now thinking, and they've known about the long-term plan. Before we go any further, I want to just say a few things here. One, we're just reporting this. We're not cheering it on, or we're not saying we're for it or anything. We're saying that there's high-level secret societies who have an interest in transforming the human race. That's in their books. We have the Bible saying that the aliens are transforming the human race, the Elohim. We have many abductee reports, which are, you have to admit that if you read the majority of abductee reports, there's almost always something medical going on, right? And also something reproductive going on. And so what Jonny is saying is that they're going to put in these patches, or is it part of the coronavirus? It may be, are going to make human race infertile, and men are not going to reproduce.
You know what's interesting, Jay? Just like what you were just saying, Sylvia Brown says in her End of Days book, yes, that she says in her prediction, she wrote this back in 2008, she said that there would be a pneumonia-like virus, and again, that cytokine storm, that autoimmune response of the lungs and the AC2 enzyme response that comes up. She said that this would take off in the year 2020. She wrote that in 2008. She nailed it. I mean, absolutely, without a doubt, wrote this in her book. It's absolutely incredible. She said it would be with us for 10 years and that would make one final appearance. Well, that's what I was told in the briefings that I had, is that this would be with us for 10 years, that it would be a hybridization program that would make one last hurrah in 2030. 2030 is the big completion of it. After 2030, that is a great sign that the biological portion of those changes is over. So this will be controlled. She said it would kind of disappear after this year because they would have a means to control it. Of course, we know that.
Well,
but there would be.
I know right now you're probably half the people are comprehending what you're saying and are completely freaking out, and the other half still haven't comprehended what you're saying. So I'm going to repeat it just so you get what's going on here. They're going to put CRISPR technology in these immune vaccines, and the CRISPR technology is going to go through and remove things from you, turn genes off like the warrior gene. So we're going to become less aggressive as a human race. Probably I've heard they're also going to do other things. They're going to turn off a lot of the genetics around cancer and
Yes.
Death, and they're going to erase death, which is another goal, by the way, of the alchemist Freemasons, is that everyone lives to be a couple thousand years old.
And this most certainly is how these biotechnologies work. With that being said, I'm speaking with the caveat that I'm like the rest of you guys watching this. I don't want to take the first version of anything, and I would most certainly, do whatever I could to do that, dance around things. I would opt to take the antibody test if they give me the option. They say, hey, do you want to be poked with some mystery fluid, or do you want to take the antibody test? You can already know what my answer is going to be.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. I'm Jay Weidner. Been watching Jonny Enoch talk about what's going to happen in the future. Appreciate you subbing and sharing and all the rest. And part 2 will be next. Thanks for watching.